Okay, everybody, welcome to this webinar. My name is Joe Morris. I'm a principal consultant with IBIS. I've been doing consulting now with Great Plains for about, I'm pushing 15 years now. And prior to that, I was working in public accounting for about, almost 10 years. So don't work backwards too far there, but been doing this for quite a while. And the purpose of this this webinar is to look at, just do a quick little walkthrough on Microsoft Dynamics workflows. So it won't be a full-blown training on workflows, but give you a little taste of what's involved with the setup, what's involved with underlying infrastructure, and then what it takes to set up a workflow and process a workflow through in Great Plains. So hopefully this will give you a little bit of a taste of what workflows are capable of doing. So what we're going to be covering in this webinar is we're going to look at what a workflow is. We'll look at the requirements for installing workflow. Point 3 there is a real important part of implementing workflow. It's something I really push folks on, is to make certain that there's a lot of planning around setting up workflow, especially around the infrastructure. Then we're going to look at workflow types and workflow participants. Then we're going to actually go through a workflow setup. We're going to create a workflow. We're going to add steps to that workflow, and then we're going to process some of those all the way through within GP. And then at the end, we'll look at some of the reports that come out of the workflow process. So that's going to be the goal. We're going to try and knock this out within about 45 minutes and leave just a little bit of time for questions at the end. So what is a workflow? A workflow really is just, it defines how a document, meaning a transaction or a master record, like a setup record within GP, how that document flows through GP by showing who must approve the record and the conditions for the approval, meaning what is the purpose or what drives the approval process. And really overall the purpose is to create control over the document flow within GP by adding an approval process to specific documents or master records. And another thing that's pretty important about just knowing about workflow is that you can't really implement workflow without SharePoint. Dynamics GP workflow is an integration with SharePoint workflow. So in order to implement workflow within your organization, you have to have SharePoint installed and configured in order to install GP workflow. So important little detail there. In fact, what I find is that most people do have SharePoint, so it's a pretty small leap to get that in place. So the workflow requirements, in order to get workflow up and running foundationally, is SharePoint. You'll need SharePoint. You can have one of two versions. One is the SharePoint Foundation version, which is the free, unlicensed version of SharePoint. Or you can have the full-blown licensed version with all the features with a SharePoint Office server. In addition, you have to have a workflow web application. And some people install that themselves, but when you install the GP workflow, you can also choose to install the web application within SharePoint itself. And when you install the GP workflow, again, you have the option to install the web application, but it also installs the ever-important web services, which is the engine that drives the integration between SharePoint workflow and GP. And if anybody's ever worked with workflow thus far, they'll find web services is typically that piece that always requires a little bit of troubleshooting in terms of the initial install. So this is something that if I was working with you on setting up workflow, this is this is one of the most important things that I like to do before we even get going is first thing I like to do is decide what type of workflow needs to be created. So we're going to walk through our workflow types here in just a minute or two. But the first thing you want to do is decide what type of workflow do you need. Is it a PO approval? Is it a receivables approval? So you want to look at what type you need to have created. And then you have to look at the conditions for creating the workflow task. So what that means is that how many steps are going to be involved with that workflow task. And the reason that's important is the second point there is that the installation of the web server really drives this whole implementation. And if you're going to take away anything from this workflow webinar is that you have to be really careful about where that SharePoint installation goes. Workflow can take require a lot of resources from the server. What we found is that if there's a lot of steps in the workflow, that you can have errors in the process. So we really recommend that if you have heavy processing in your workflows, that you really give the web server its own server. And we highly recommend that you set up a server with 32 gigs of memory. And again, there at the bottom it says if heavy usage should reside on its own server. We had an example. Somebody put their. We really didn't know how much what the resource requirements were for their SharePoint workflow implementation, and we actually put a sales tax application on that same web server, and we just continue to have errors with that as a result of heavy resource usage on that server. So I highly recommend that you do a little bit of planning before you ever set up workflow and set up that server. So here are the different workflow types. The types that you had to set up. So if you want to look at setting up an approval process, here are your different types of workflows. You have the PO approval, which we'll spend a little bit of time going through. You have sales quote approval. You have customer credit limit override approval. You have vendor approval, general ledger batch approval, payables management batch approval, receivables management batch approval, and then also with the HR series, you have the employee onboard approval and the employee personnel approval. And then lastly, if you have controls over system screens and changing a system screen to electronic signatures, you can also create a workflow for that as well. So and some other terminology within workflow are what we call participants. So when we set up users within workflow, the way workflow works is that a user is assigned to a workflow based on their Active Directory login. It's not based on a SQL login, it's based on an Active Directory login. So the different types of security roles, and workflow calls them participants, are an administrator. The administrator is the person that actually installs workflow, and they have all rights. They have keys to the kingdom on that one. And then there's the manager who can create workflows. They can view open workflows, or what we call tasks, and they can act on any of those tasks. And then what we have is an originator. So an originator is a person that actually creates the document. So the person is creating an APO or creating a new vendor or creating a receivables transaction. They would be categorized as an originator. And then you have an approver or also a delegate. And these people are simply the ones that complete the task. So they're the ones that ultimately are approving the document. And the nice thing about this is that an approver or a delegate doesn't actually have to be a GP user. So what we find is a lot of these people who are approvers really never get into Great Plains. They can see all the documents that they need to see through an email or through SharePoint without ever having to have a GP license. So we're going to go through a little bit of the workflow setup. So I'm going to actually go over there. So go into SharePoint now. And here you can see where it all starts. So workflow, after you have SharePoint set up, you go into the SharePoint administration, and then you set up your workflows. And we're going to walk through this process. After you set up SharePoint within administration, then you're going to go into GP and set up the workflow there. So let's actually get in and take a look at workflows. So this is the home page of Dynamics Workflow. So if you were getting into Dynamics Workflow the first time, this is what you would see. To set up a workflow, where you would go is in the Administration tab here. So here's where you would set up your first workflow. You can see I have a couple of them already in place. But the first thing you do is go in here to where it says Select Workflow Type to use. So you click on the Select Workflow Type. And here are the different types. We talked about each one of these. So you check the box that identifies the workflow type. After you check the box, you identify who your managers are going to be for those different workflows. So what that would do is identify the person who would be in charge of creating the workflow itself. So after you check the box, go ahead and put in the username for the person that's going to be the manager, the person that's going to be the manager of these workflows. So after you do that, click back here on the Administration tab. Now the very first time that you set up a workflow, what you'll want to do is click on Modify Workflow Calendar and identify really what your work days are. And the purpose for doing this is when you set up a workflow, you'll basically determine how many days you have to complete the transaction. So the days that it allows to complete that transaction will be based on the work days that you have set up here. So if you basically put Saturday in as a work day, it'll include that in the number of days that you have to complete a task. So that you only really have to do that one time. After you select the workflow type to use, then you can come down here and create a new workflow. So you go here to New Workflow, and we'll just create one here from scratch. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a vendor approval workflow. So this is the actual workflow itself. Each workflow, you can create as many workflows as you want. However, let me restate that. You can create as many workflows as you want for each type. So in this case, I'm creating a vendor approval workflow. I can create as many of these as I want. However, if you look down here, I have this little activate and deactivate radio button here. I can only have one of these active at any one time. So the initial creation of workflow, I can only have one be active at any time. However, within the workflow, I will create what's called workflow steps. And here I can create as many steps as I want in here. I had a discussion with one of the developers at Microsoft, and they said they have customers with over 200 steps in their workflow. So you can create a lot of steps within the actual workflow itself. So in this case, we're going to call this we'll just call this a demo workflow. So right off the bat, we're going to not activate this. I already have one activated, so I'll leave that one active. The next step here is we determine who the originators are. So if we only want to execute a workflow when a specific user, and when I say user, that is Active Directory user, not a specific GP login user, but when a specific Active Directory user creates a document GP, it will initiate this workflow. What I find most people do at this step here is they leave it as end user. So basically it leaves it wide open. You may want to have one that's specific just for maybe a category of users, but what we find is that the users or the conditions are typically captured within the step. But it's really up to you on what you do there. And then the next step here is you can choose to give users read-only access to workflow information. So that means they can see it, but they can't act on the information. Then down below here we have creation of the workflow steps, which we'll circle back around here on. After you create the workflow steps, you determine what you're going to do in terms of an approver. So in this case, we're going to basically tell the workflow that we always want to require at least one approver. So at least one person needs to provide some approval process on this workflow. The next step after this is that you can define an alternate final approver. So you may have approvers within the workflow steps, but ultimately you may want to have someone above that final approver actually look at and approve the document. So in that case, if that user changes or edits the document, it still goes through a final approval step. And this part is a real critical piece, and I highly recommend if you are executing on implementing workflows is that you activate delegation. And what that means is that it gives you the ability to assign approval to a different person. So especially if someone's out on vacation and they're going to be on vacation for a little while, you may want to create the ability to manually assign or automatically assign delegation to somebody else. And then also what we determine here at the end is what happens when a workflow step is overdue. So we may determine that a document needs to be approved within a day. So this workflow will tell us what do we do if that person does not execute on their transaction within a day. So we may tell it to delegate to the next approver, or we may delegate to someone specific. In addition, what we have the ability to do is have the system automatically approve the task or reject the overdue task. What I find most of the time is that it goes to a specific person. Down here at the bottom, we have our notification process. Real important, and I didn't really cover this in the system setup, is that part of setting up workflow is setting up a SMTP server so that you're able to, and setting up that SMTP server is on the SharePoint side. So what that will give you the ability to do is send out email notifications to your users. So what this alert process does is it gives us the ability to communicate when a workflow task has been assigned. So in this case, this tells us to send a Microsoft Dynamics desktop alert. So I personally like to have that in place. And then we have the ability to send email alerts. So we can, our choices are don't send email alerts. And the reason you would have that is that if you have a lot of steps or a lot of workflows, sometimes the emails can get a little overwhelming. I've had clients shut down the email alerts because it just gets to be a little bit too much. So, especially if you're getting those immediate emails. So instead what you may have is a daily email summary, which identifies all those tasks that have been assigned to you just once a day. Or in addition, you can send a weekly email summary. So if you don't have high demand to have transactions approved quickly, then you can have that email sent as a summary weekly. And then you could tell the, if you decide to do it weekly, you could tell when that goes out. So now let's go ahead and add our workflow steps. So we're going to go ahead and do this for our vendor approval. So this is going to be our first step in the process. So we'll call this vendor approval. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to call this the first step in the process. And your choices are this is the first step in the process or this is a step that follows a selected step. You can have multiple steps in your workflow that are all set up as a first step. So if you have different conditions on your workflow, which we'll talk about when we look at POs here in a minute, you can have all those set up as a first step. So we're going to set this up as the first step. So our workflow step types are approval or action. In this case, we're setting this up as an approval. So this first step is going to create an approval whenever this document is created. The other way that we have it is an action. So when conditions are met, we send an email out to a user that says the class ID is missing. Go in and update the class ID. So that would send an email out to somebody to say that class ID needs to be updated. We're going to set this up as approval. And then we can determine what are the conditions for approving this transaction. I'm looking at a vendor approval, but what I could do is say, instead of have it approved every time we create a vendor transaction, I could say, I only want to require approval when we have these different options. So when the vendor ID meets a certain condition, the name, class ID, short name, again, you can see all the options we have to create as a filter to determine the condition for the approval. So what I've seen in this case is when a certain class of vendors are created. So we could say where the class ID is, or we could say where it contains, begins with, is not, does not contain, is not greater than and includes, is less than and includes, or even more importantly, especially if you're looking at an action. So if we were saying if where the class ID is empty, we would want a specific action. I would want somebody to get into that vendor card and update the class ID. And for this example, we're going to say always. So we're going to require approval always. So whenever a vendor record is created, we want approval. So down here, we indicate who the approvers are going to be. So for this example, I'm going to choose Phyllis. Actually, I'm going to do a lookup here. So I'm going to click here on this book. If I knew the name, I could type in the name and then click on the check mark here. So I want to do a lookup. So I'm going to find Phyllis. Type P, do a lookup. And Phyllis is my person who I want to approve. And I'll click Add. So whenever any vendor card is created, any new vendor is created, Phyllis has to approve that. If I had multiple approvers here, I could choose that I only wanted one to respond, or I had to have the majority approve, or I could tell it that all must approve that record. Then down here, we basically identify the number of days that the approver had to complete their step. So when we talked about setting up that calendar as part of the first step, this is how it determines how many days before that task becomes overdue. And then lastly, what we can do is send out emails to notify specific people when conditions of that workflow have been met. So once that workflow has been approved, we can set specific people here to be notified when that workflow has been approved or assigned. So if a workflow has been assigned to somebody, if a change has been requested, we can identify there. If a record has been rejected, delegated, or even escalated. So we can send out specific notifications. It's a great tool just from experience. You have to be a little bit careful of going overboard on these because again, I've seen it where people are just overwhelmed with the number of emails that come through, and after a while, people just tend to ignore the email. So you have to be a little bit careful, very deliberate, and who gets what in terms of email notification. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. So once you have it in place, important little detail, and I hear this a lot, is that I created that workflow, but I created that workflow step, but it's gone now. And the reason is you do have to save it. So once you go in, you have to click Save. Then after you save that workflow step, it takes you to the main workflow page here. So we have our demo workflow. You still have to save that workflow. Oops. I got to put, I'm actually going to change that to take no action. And click Save. Okay. I'm going to create one more workflow, and this time I'm going to do it with POs. So I'm going to create a new workflow, POs. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but I'll hopefully walk through each step. So we're going to create a purchase order workflow. And what this will do is this, whenever a new purchase order is created, before that purchase order can be printed and sent out, it would have to be approved through the SharePoint workflow. So we're going to call this new PO. We're going to leave this inactive. We're going to tell it any user that creates a PO. We're going to let anybody look at it and make changes. So from here, I'm going to create a workflow step. And I'm going to do this based on a buyer ID equal SA. So I'm going to call this is the first step. And this step is going to require approval. However, I'm only going to require approval when the buyer ID is equal to SA. So whenever the buyer ID is equal to SA, I want that to go through an approval process. So the approver is going to be see if I can type this in. So yes, I think it is. Oh. So whenever the buyer ID is equal to SA, it's going to require approval. Now what that means is that if the buyer ID equals something else, the workflow will say no approval required. So only if the buyer ID equals SA will it require a workflow process. But if the buyer is not equal to SA, it won't care. It will just say you don't need approval. So we're going to set the approver equal to Philip Harris. We're going to set the number of days equal to 1, and we're not sending out any carbon copies. I'll click save. Again, I'll click save. Important little details, remember to save. So now I'm going to actually add another workflow step. And I'm going to say buyer ID equal to sign assay. In this case, again, we're going to look for approval. And I'm going to actually say this is a first step. So I don't really care if it follows the next step. I basically only care if the conditions are met. I don't necessarily care what step it follows in. I only care if the conditions are met. So I'm going to come down here, select only, where buyer ID is sign. You can also add an additional filter. So I can add another where clause in here. So here are my options here. So I can choose buyer ID, contract number, customer, a common condition is item number, or even site ID. So the line site ID. So if it's going to a specific location, it may require a approval. If that's met. So you can have multiple conditions with this as well. And the reason I created this as another step is that we don't really have an or clause in here. It's just an and. So that's why I'm creating another step in here. And then again, I identify my approver. Spelled again. All right. Okay. Now we've created our workflow. The next step after we create these is that we go into GP after we've already created those workflows. Since I already have two activated, I'm going to leave those activated. So the next step would be go to Dynamics GP Tools, Setup, and then go into Workflow Setup. So here what you would need to do is check the box to activate the workflow. So even though you have SharePoint all in place, you still have to activate the workflow. And then also you have to identify where the web service, workflow web service is located, and then the SharePoint location for your workflow. So those steps would need to be populated in this screen for workflow to come up. So typically what I hear just troubleshooting this is that you'll have a workflow all set up, but you don't see it come up in GP. And the reason is that you may have the wrong locations in place or you forgot to activate it. So now let's go ahead and go through two workflows. So we're going to do a vendor workflow and a PO workflow. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to go into cards, and I'm logged in here in this specific screen. I'm logged in with a couple of screens here. I'm logged in as Phyllis over here. And I'm logged in as administrator here. So I'm going to go and I'm going to create a new vendor. And I'm going to call this Joe's Plumbing. That's just what I like to do. I give it a class ID. And now I have this in place. You'll see up here in the screen, here are the workflow. You can see the workflow objects on this screen here. You have the workflow history. You have the not submitted, which tells you the status of this document. And then you can see what you have here for submitting for workflow. So I just created this. I can choose to save it for later, to submit later, or I can go ahead and submit for approval now. And from here, I can add a comment. And where this comment goes, it goes in the email or desktop notification. So if you're looking for it in any of the documents that show up in SharePoint, you won't see it. You'll only see it in an email or in the desktop notification. So we'll put a comment in here. Need go to and so you can click on these buttons here. One is high priority, low priority. So that just gives an indication in the email the priority of this approval process. I'm going to go ahead and click submit. And then hopefully right away we'll see a little notification for the email. One thing about being in this environment, one of the things you really see about, oh, there we go. So we see the email coming through. This is actually going to Phyllis here. I have Phyllis's email set up here. The desktop notification in this environment can take a little bit of time. So one of the things I can do now if I'm Phyllis is I can open up my email and see the approval. So what this means is that Phyllis doesn't actually have to be a GP user to approve this task. So here you can click on edit this task, or you can view the document to see your details about the document here. And here you can see all the GL accounts that are with Joe's Plumbing. Or Phyllis can actually go into the card itself. So Phyllis can come into the vendor card and open up Joe's Plumbing. And approve it within this screen. There's three ways to approve a document in workflow. One of them is within GP itself. The second way is within email, so you can approve the document within the email. So you come up here and you can approve, reject, delegate, so you can delegate to a different user. You can request that elements of that document change, or you can cancel. You can also type comments here. The next way to do it is within SharePoint itself. So you can come into SharePoint. So I don't have that set up for on the vendors. We'll look at that through the PO. So now within the vendor maintenance, here are her options. So she can approve, she can recheck, she can request a change. So she could say class ID does not look right. Request a change. And what this will do is it will go back to the original user to make a change on the class ID. We bring that vendor back up. See that we typically we would get an email through or a desktop notification that tells us that this needs to be changed. I can also see it in my workflow history. See that see the note that was regarding this document. So I can make the change and then submit for approval. Submit. And now, see, I'm getting the emails coming through now. They're a little bit slow. You can see the right here. You can see the desktop notification coming through. So Phyllis is going to go ahead and approve this. And we have just created a vendor. So prior to going through, and approving this document, the vendor would not be able, you would not be able to use the vendor for anything until this document is approved. So once you turn on workflow and the document, see, you're seeing our little desktop notification come through here. Once you turn on workflow, it creates a hold on these processes until the document is approved. So lastly, we'll do a PO. We're going to walk through a PO real quick. Let's create a brand new PO. Again, it tells us not submitted. I'm not going to worry about the buyer ID on this one. And we will buy a processor. And this is really some expensive processor. Wow, look at that. I was able to get a better deal. I bought for $50. And going to the warehouse. And again, I can just click Save for Later, or I can submit it for approval, which if you want to print the document or execute on this document, it would have to be approved. We'll go ahead and submit for approval. Phyllis should be getting a little desktop notification at some point here. Got an email. Again, we'll take a look at that PO. Get an email. So I'm going to take a look at the document here. And this shows me the details of the document. So buying a item number processor, ordering 10 at $50. Here's the inventory account. Here's the vendor item. Here's the total cost. Any comments that would have been sent along with that in the PO itself. So in the PO, you can create the comments. You would also see that in this document. So here, you can, Phyllis would be able to approve this document. And since I'm logged in as the administrator on this session, I'm actually going to go into Phyllis. And there we go. So what you see here, there's a couple of different steps. I'm going to go back to the workflow for the PO. So for the PO simple, what we had here is we had two steps. We had the approve the PO, and then as an action, we had notify the shipping department. This was an action that was to be executed along with the approval process. So when we look at Phyllis's task list, these are all the tasks that have been assigned to Phyllis. We can see that she has the approval for PO 2100, but she also has an action that she needs to act on as well. So we can click here on this approval within SharePoint. So we're looking at SharePoint task here, which looks exactly like how we had it on the within the email. So we click approve, and now we just approve that that PO. And the last step that we have to act on is we need to notify the shipping department. So we would need to notify them that items are coming in. And so once I've done this, I can click completed, which tells me I've already notified them. So that takes it off my task list. So now our only other task is to approve that PO, which that's a pretty old PO, so we'll just leave that one alone. So that's really the basic steps of creating the workflow. Another thing to know about workflow is that any time, just as a general rule, that you make a change to a workflow, so if you come in here and make a change to a workflow, I wouldn't do it too often. It's difficult to do in the middle of the day. So if you have a big change to a workflow, you only want to do that in the evening when everybody is off the system. Specifically, if you're going to deactivate and activate a different workflow, you would want to make certain that you have all your users off. In addition, anytime you make the change, you have to log out of GP and log back in order to recognize those changes. Specifically, if you are, the very first time that you set up workflow is that when you activate this workflow, you have to log out of GP and log back in. And then lastly, if you're running reports, again, I'm in my session of workflow here. We have our tasks. It shows all your open tasks. Any open, I'll let that close here. We have our open documents. We have our reports, which we'll look at here in a second. One of the things I want to, two more things I want to look at here is this what's called My Delegation. Within My Delegation, what you're seeing here is within this demo environment, we have a lot of different companies. So those are all the workflows with all the companies that we have installed. We have delegate workflow tasks. So one of the things that you can do is if you know you're going to be on vacation, you can delegate your workflow task to go to somebody else. So you say I'm going to be on vacation from 8/27 through through August 31st. So during that time, it will move all your workflows approvals to a specific user. Another thing you want to do, and this should be for all users, is to set up alerts. So identify for them specifically what type of email they want to see. So when we created the workflow, we enabled it to send email alerts, but we can specifically identify at a user level to not receive email. So even though we set it up at the workflow to send out emails, individual users can turn it off and on as well. And then the last part that we're going to cover, and then we'll open it up to any questions, are specific reports. And just as a side note, these reports are SharePoint reports. All of the data is also held within the company database itself. So even though it takes a little bit to create reports out of GP for that, it's very possible to grab that data out of Great Company. So here are some of the reports that you have. You can create a report, completed tasks by approvers, completed tasks by workflow, completed documents report, active tasks. This is actually a very big one here. You want to see all your active tasks that are still haven't been cleared out. So I'm going to go ahead and open this, and maybe we won't see it. Oops, I'll put a date in. Very particular about dates. And we process our report. So we want to see all of our open tasks. We can process this report. You can see it's churning away up here. I'm not going to go through a lot of these. In this environment, it's taken a little bit of time to process these reports. So here, this is showing all of the active approvals that are still out there. You see some ones that didn't get cleared out from my setup from yesterday. It's a nice little document. It puts it out as an Excel file, which is really nice. You can sort it and send it off. And again, you can do the same with completed tasks by approvers, by workflow. A lot of different options there. It really solves a lot of problems in terms of controlling document flow within GP. But the one thing you have to really watch out for is where you put that. So if you have a lot of steps in your workflow, you want to make certain that that web server is capable of handling that. The part that trips up a lot of people with workflow is the one workflow per type. So that's another thing you have to watch out for. So when we create our workflows, you can only have one active workflow per type. However, you can have multiple steps within that workflow itself. All right, so we'll go ahead and call it unless anybody has another question. But I appreciate everybody getting on the call. And again, this is just a quick walkthrough of workflow. If you have any questions or need any help, we're good at doing this, so we can certainly help you through it. And hopefully you got a lot out of it. So thank you very much.